Anyone else remember when this was a story about the Judoon looking for a fugitive in Gloucester? Yes, hello guys, and welcome back to another Doctor Who Series 12 review. This time we're taking a look at Fugitive of the Judoon, co-written by Vinny Patel and Chris Chibnall. However, I think the writing credits should be switched because this story seems much more written by Chris Chibnall than Vinny Patel. Now, you know how in my Orphan 55 review I said that in every series there's an episode that you really like and everyone else dislikes. Now, we've reached the point in this series where you get the episode that you're not really a big fan of, but everyone else is raving about. That episode is Fugitive of the Judoon. I went into this episode quite positively because, to be honest, this series has been pretty good so far. Probably the worst episode was Orphan 55, but even then, that was still a solid 6.5 out of 10. That was still a solidly enjoyable episode. Spyfall, especially the second part, was really good, and Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror I thought was fantastic. So this series has been pretty good so far. And then we get a story like Fugitive of the Judoon, which is bringing back an old enemy of the Doctor's. And it's the Judoon, which I thought was quite interesting, an interesting choice to bring back, because they're the type of villain that only really have one dedicated story, which is Smith and Jones, which I quite like. However, they're not exactly a prolific threat, because despite the fact they've appeared a number of times in the Stolen Earth Journey's End, they appeared in the Pandorica Opens, and I believe they featured in The Magician's Apprentice as well. They haven't actually featured that much. As I said, they've only had one dedicated story, which is Smith and Jones. They appeared much more prominently in the Sarah Jane Adventures, along with enemies like the Slovene. So it was interesting that we were going to get another fully fledged Judoon story in this series, aptly titled Fugitive of the Judoon, which we think would see the Judoon playing a very big role. And they do, for the first half of the story. Then the story goes off into very weird and unexpected directions that most fans seem to like, but I think kind of sour the story for me. Now, this episode reminds me a lot of Stephen Moffat and his episodes. Now, most people will know, if you've been following the channel, that when Stephen Moffat Who is good, it's my favourite Doctor Who. That's why I love Matt Smith's era so much, particularly the early half of his era, because it was when Moffat was at his best. However, whereas Spyfall Part 2 reminded me of good Stephen Moffat Doctor Who, this episode kind of reminds me of the worst that Stephen Moffat had to offer. Or at least maybe not necessarily the worst, but his downfalls as a writer and what made people really start to dislike him. Because this episode was advertised as a story about the Judoon. However, what we really get is essentially a story of setup, a story where there's various things that Chris Chibnall needs to set up for the rest of the series, and he has nowhere to set them up. He doesn't know where to put all this setup, so he essentially just hijacks an episode and puts it all in there, regardless of whether it really fits. While I think many fans really like the surprises that we get in this episode, the WTF moments, and are really intrigued to see where these things are going, I think a lot of fans really ignore the actual story itself. They're focusing on the setup and where that's going to go, but they're not really focusing on the story itself, because this story is mostly setup, and therefore I think it's really not going to have that much of a good rewatchability factor. And depending on where all this stuff goes, I think we may look back on this episode and think that it's not really that good at all. It's very clear to see that Vinny Patel pitched a Judoon story to Chris Chibnall, a Judoon story set in Gloucester, where the Judoon are actually on the Earth, which, when you think about it, in Doctor Who at least, discounting the Sarah Jane Adventures, we've never actually seen the Judoon on Earth. Present day Earth anyway. I know they technically were in the Pandorica Opens. That's actually interesting when you think that's a bit basic, but like I said, when you think about it, we haven't actually seen that before. Them actually going into somewhere and looking for a fugitive. We just saw it on a hospital before, on the moon in Smith and Jones. It seems like that's the story Vinny Patel pitched, and then Chris Chibnall has some, yeah, I kind of like that. But then he's took that story and heavily rewritten it. So most of the episode actually isn't what Vinny Patel wrote. It's actually Chris Chibnall's setup disguised as Vinny Patel's story. I think that works for the first 36 minutes of this episode. But then at the 36th minute, you really should be hearing the credits. And this being a two-parter. But it isn't. Unfortunately, this episode does not finish 36 minutes in. It is 49 minutes long. And therefore, 15 minutes at the end of this episode really should have been a whole 50-minute episode. And it isn't. And that's what makes it so much like setup, because it's not done smoothly. This story as a whole doesn't really have a good resolution, because it starts off well, but then it slowly just gets into more and more setup, and by the end you kind of forgot what the point of this story really was at the beginning. But yes, let's run down a quick synopsis. So, the Judoon have come to Gloucester, and they're looking for a fugitive, and the Doctor and her friends obviously can't have that. They've shielded off, so it's merely Gloucester, and there's shields so no one can get in, no one can get out. The Judoon coming, cataloguing people as they do, kill a couple of people who get in their way, and it seems like they're looking for the character Lee, who's a bit shady. You don't really know what's going on. He seems very coy, he seems to know what's going on, despite the fact if you were just seeing a random bunch of rhino-headed alien policemen, you'd probably be a bit weirded out, but he seems to know what's going on, so instantly you're pointing fingers at him. That seems like an interesting story. However, Fugitive isn't quite what you seem. Is Lee really the one who's behind it? That seems like a good story. That, I imagine, is what Vinny Patel pitched to Chris Chibnall. However, that doesn't feel the whole 50 minutes, or at least it could have, but it doesn't here, because Chris Chibnall has to fit in all his other stuff. It feels like two separate stories pushed into one, which is why it would have been so ideal for a two-parter. It makes no sense to me. I've never seen an episode of Doctor Who in my life that shouldn't have been a two-parter more than this one. It even, out of the 36th minute, it's even built up like it's going to be a cliffhanger, and then it just isn't. And I don't see why it could have been, honestly. 5 more minutes of the Judoon doing their stuff in Gloucester, and this would have been a perfect first part to a second part story. Just like Spyfall, the two parts are a bit disconnected in terms of part 1, it's about the Doctor investigating all these spies, and then the second part is a chase through time with the Master. However, they work, and it's almost like if you had Spyfall, 36 minutes in, it's revealed, oh, it's the Master, and the whole of Spyfall Part 2 is squeezed into 13 minutes. It would have been quite crap, wouldn't it have been? That's what this story is. As I said, it's interesting because that seems like Vinny Patel wanted to tell a good Judoon story, and Chris Chibnall said, I like that idea, but let me just do something with it, and then rewrote it, and he basically included all his setup. And in that sense, you got to feel a bit sorry for Vinny Patel. I wasn't a big fan of his other story, Demons of the Punjab. I thought it was quite lazy in how it avoided the actual good potential of the episode and just decided to shove its characters in a barn somewhere rather than putting them at the heart of the conflict and the historical event. However, he seems like he wanted to do a good Judoon story, and it is a good Judoon story for 36 minutes. And then it just ends in the last 13 minutes. Just feels so rushed. Now, they were hyping this up, the BBC, which I thought was quite odd. Oh, if you thought the Master coming back was good, wait until you see this. And everyone was like, who's coming back? Like, who could be better than the Master? And it's interesting who they were really talking about, because there's two surprise WTF moments that happened in this episode. Although I think the one they were mainly referring to is Captain Jack. John Barrowman is back as Captain Jack. I like Captain Jack. I think he's brilliant in Series 1 as well as Series 3 and 4. And he's brilliant in Torchwood. And I've listened to some Torchwood audios from Big Finish, and he's brilliant in that as well. And he's always said that he wants Torchwood to come back and he wants to return as Captain Jack. I would have loved him to come back, however this just isn't the story for him to come back in. Because essentially he feels so out of place. He just kind of comes into the story. He doesn't really have anything to do with the main plot. And he just kind of comes in to foreshadow events that have nothing to do with this story. You could have replaced Captain Jack coming in, saying, beware the lone Cyberman, with Chris Chibnall coming in and saying, yeah, the Cybermen are coming back later in the series. And it basically would have had the same impact. Because that's all it is, it's just Chibnall foreshadowing the events of the finale, but disguised as a Captain Jack return. And it feels so out of place in this episode, and it just shouldn't be. As I said, it's nice to see John Barrowman back, but you could have saved that reveal for a story where he actually has something to do. As I said, if this would have been a two-parter, Captain Jack could have been in the second part a lot more and actually had good interactions with the companions. Him and the companions could have gone off on a side quest, kind of, where they maybe explore more of who the Lone Side Men are. Obviously, we wouldn't actually see it because that's all finale setup, but I feel you could have actually made his return a lot more substantial than just foreshadowing disguised as a return of the character. So I kind of feel that maybe he shouldn't have come back. This may feel very harsh on John Barrowman. I love John Barrowman and I love Captain Jack, but at the end of the day, he is very much an RTD character. I feel that if they wanted to have a character like Captain Jack, they should have just created a new one. You know, they should have created a character like Captain Jack themselves, very much like Stephen Moffat created River Song to fulfill a bit of the Captain Jack role. You know, River Song was the Moffat equivalent of Captain Jack, and I think we could have saw the Chibnall equivalent if you wanted a character like that. Rather than bring back Captain Jack, I just feel it's a bit lazy. I'm glad John Barrowman's back, but maybe they could have created someone else to fulfill this kind of role. Because I feel it is almost lazy bringing back Captain Jack. It's almost like Chibnall can't be bothered to create a character, so he's just bringing back an RTD one. Which obviously would make people excited, but I don't think it really shows glimmering prowess of him as a writer. As I said, this episode is really uneven. It's really fast paced. It's got to get everything it wants to do done in 50 minutes. Essentially has to get 120 minutes worth of Doctor Who into 49 minutes. And that is a problem. It's a problem in any story. It's the problem with the Power of Three, and it's the problem with this story. However, the problem with this story is it's not even a resolution, because it's not telling you what's happening because you need to. It's going to tell you in another story, presumably. So it just leaves this story really weird. It just makes it feel so rushed, and it makes it feel so unsubstantial. There's no substance to this story, because when I finished watching it, it just made me feel so empty. Like, what had I just watched? I'd watched a story that should have been a two-parter condensed into 49 minutes with no real resolution. Essentially just watched an advertisement for the second half of the series. However, whereas A Good Man Goes to War is an episode completely based on setting up stuff, I think that episode works because you knew it was going to be that. There's no mid-story subversion where it ends up being about setting up plot elements. That episode is plot elements, plain and simply. This episode, Fugitive of the June, reminded me much more of Let's Go Hitler, a story that you think is going to be about Hitler, but actually is just about River Song. Woohoo! And I think this episode is better than Let's Go Hitler, but the same principle applies, that it's a story that had a great basis, but then just goes off into setup and kind of leaves the actual story behind. This episode starts off promisingly. It sees the Judoon around Gloucester, which is really a nice image. I forgot how nice it was to see aliens actually on Earth, you know, kind of invading. We haven't seen that for a very long time. We haven't seen that probably since Dark Water. And, you know, it's nice to see here. I forgot how much I liked that. It's nice to see the Judoon going around Gloucester. It's a nice image. Nice to be out of London, out of Sheffield, Gloucester. Bit of a weird setting, but lovely all the same. I think the Doctor's very good as well. We get the opening scene where the Doctor refuses to tell the TARDIS team about the Master and what she's looking for, what happened to Gallifrey. And Jodie Whittaker's really brilliant. I've praised Jodie Whittaker a lot in the series because I really was very disappointed with her in Series 11. Not all her fault, but the writing, the general Doctor package as a whole, the writing, the performance, didn't really do anything for me. However, this series, the writing and her herself, it's all rose to the challenge. I think the serious moments she's actually getting now, and she's actually performing them rather well. Moments where she's in the TARDIS and refuses to tell them about Gallifrey was brilliant. It's another darker moment for the Doctor, but I also like the fact that she isn't just going to tell the companions anything. She's no longer a whimsy tour guide for these few people. She's actually a character now, a character with a past, a character who has a fuse, a character that isn't just going to tell these people anything. She's really bringing out the dual side of the Doctor, which is what really makes the character special and something she lacked in Series 11. However, consistently we're getting these moments, and I think anything with her to do with Gallifrey is really good because that brings out the best of the Doctor and the Doctor's performance. Yeah, that's a great contained scene. And like I said, the Judoon around Gloucester is a nice image. I like the character of Lee, played by Neil Stuke. He has the kind of performance that makes him seem like you're kind of a useless husband, essentially. But also he's got a brilliant mix of, he knows what's going on, and you don't know if you can trust him, but you kind of feel like you can. You don't feel as if he's a bad guy, but you feel like you shouldn't trust him. It's a good performance, despite the fact he gets killed. He's essentially the Doctor's companion. I'll get onto that in a minute. But he's essentially the Doctor's companion, and you can kind of see that on a rewatch, the kind of subtle things placed in there. It's all about Ruth. Who is she? Because we think the fugitive is Lee, but it isn't. It's Ruth, which was a nice little subversion. Doctor takes Ruth, and Lee ends up confronting the Judoon who have been hired by Gat. Now, it's later revealed that Gat is from Gallifrey, and the actress who plays Gat was fine. I don't think she was that all convincing, being menacing, and I think a better actor would have made that character a lot better. However, she dies in this episode, so luckily she doesn't have to appear anymore. Turns out that Lee is a Time Lord, or a Time Lord of some sort, I guess. We don't really know if he's a Time Lord, but you presume so, seeing as he clearly trained with Gat, and he was the Doctor's companion looking after her. And then he gets killed, which was a shame. I liked Lee. Yeah, while they're doing that, and the companions are off with Jack doing some things, the Doctor ends up taking Ruth to a church. And then the Judoon track them down and say that Ruth is the fugitive. And then she has a weird moment where she essentially becomes badass and goes off the Judoon's horn and they retreat. And you're like, what the hell is going on? And she's like, I don't know. And she receives a text from Lee saying, go to this lighthouse. So she does. And then it's revealed that the graves are blank. And she digs up the graves and there's a TARDIS buried inside. And you're like, what? And then Ruth comes out after breaking the glass. And she says, hello, I'm the Doctor. And she's dressed completely differently. And you're like, what? And that should have been the cliffhanger. That is 36 minutes in. That should be a cliffhanger. It's so bizarre. It's even set up like a cliffhanger. But for some reason, it isn't. That should have been the cliffhanger. Just add 5 minutes more of the Judoon, because this episode has a very quick pace, particularly towards the beginning. So just add 5 minutes more of the Judoon, and then this episode is a perfect first part. And then the second part could be the Doctor going off with this seemingly other Doctor, the companions doing a bit more with Jack, and then it all gets into a head. Rather than that, basically just being condensed down to 13 minutes. The TARDIS ends up being put into the Judoon's ship by a tractor beam, and it's revealed that the Doctor used to work for Gat. This is the Ruth Doctor I'm talking about here. And essentially that says that it's a bit more than she quit a job, and that Gat wasn't the one who hired the Judoon to get her. And essentially the Doctor tricks Gat into killing herself, and it's revealed that obviously Gallifrey isn't destroyed for those Time Lords, so what's going on? Because the Doctor saw that Gallifrey was destroyed. Bit weird, sure we'll find out later in the series, but yeah, the Judoon back off because the Doctor threatens them with a gun. Gat is destroyed, they go back into the TARDIS, the Doctor asks them to leave, and there we go. Let's talk about the Ruth Doctor then, Jo Martin as Ruth / the Doctor. I like her as Ruth. I think she's a good little actor, and she was pretty convincingly scared, pretty convincingly untrustworthy. She played that quite well. Her Doctor was okay, but it depends what you class her as the Doctor, because I thought she was a very good foil for Jodie Whittaker's Doctor, and they bounced off each other brilliantly. I think those two worked really well together. But as the Doctor herself, I didn't really feel she embodied the Time Lord personally. I know a lot of people really like her, but from what I saw, didn't really see it. I think she worked brilliantly with Jodie, and she's a great Doctor to counteract her Doctor. but as an actual doctor, I don't think she's that well-rounded. I think is a bit too grumpy to be the Doctor personally. She didn't really have any of those like charming moments that the Doctor usually has. Maybe we'll see she'll get that when we see more of her. I imagine she would, but overall, I think she was good as the Doctor in terms of being a foil for Jodie's Doctor and being like the counterpart to the Doctor. But as the Doctor herself, still needs some work. But overall, it was a nice performance. Yeah, the companions then. Ryan, Yaz and Graham. They really have nothing to do in this episode. It seems a trend where the companions really don't do anything and the Doctor seems to just go off with guest character of the week, which is interesting because the Doctor seemingly works better when she's with guest characters than she does with her own companions, so think of that what you will. It's just weird, isn't it, because they have so many companions but they don't seem to really know what to do with them. I think Chibnall was really regretting having 4 companions, to be honest. It's not needed and they don't really get anything to do. Tosin Cole has a bit more to do. He's just isn't the best actor, is he? I've seen him a number of times now in Doctor Who, and he's just very wooden. That's obviously an issue. I know he's not the best actor, and Doctor actors in the classic series will always be quite wooden. But, you know, at the end of the day, he's not the best actor, so his delivery is never going to be great. Yaz and Graham. Graham gets a bit more to do, particularly with Jack, but that's not much at all, because Jack isn't in the story that much, and Yaz gets nothing to do, as per usual. So not exactly bad, but they barely have anything to do here, because especially when you get on to most of the story, the Doctor spends it with Ruth, so really there's nothing that the companions can do here. Jodie Whittaker herself, the Doctor. Now, I kinda briefly touched on her before. I really like Jodie Whittaker in this series, as I said, and this is no exception. She's really good here. She performs the comedy really well as well. The comedy was pretty dire in most of Series 11. However, bar Spyfall Part 1, the comedy has been pretty good in this series, and she performs it very well. But it's the darker, more serious moments that are really making her shine as the Doctor in this series, and she has plenty of them. I mentioned the scene at the start, the scene where she confronts the Judoon and confronts Lee and confronts Ruth at the end, and then the companion bit at the end. I thought she's been really good in this episode, and she's impressing me more and more as the Doctor. And even if I didn't really enjoy this story that much as a whole, I enjoyed her Doctor in it, which is a nice change, because in Series 11 I didn't like the stories and I didn't like her Doctor. At least I can say now, like with most Doctors, that the Doctor is always the positive in a not so well written story. It's nice that she has now earned that trait that most actors who play the Doctor have. Talking about the end scene now, it was just a bit cringy, wasn't it? Now, I'd seen it in the trailer and it cringed me out then, and it cringed me out here. The whole use of slang, I've mentioned it before, that not just the Doctor but the companions have. As saying we're your mates, it really undercut that scene. If she just said we're your friends, it would have had so much more weight, and this may sound like a trivial thing. It is. But it really took me out of that end scene when she says it. I'm just like, that's cringe. And I think it just took all the emotion out of that scene just because she said that. And that may seem like a nitpick, and it is, but I just thought I'd just say that. The direction by Nikki Manzur, I hope I'm remembering that correctly from the credits, was interesting. I think it's pretty good for the whole. I think particularly the scene when the Doctor is standing on the lighthouse and the direction of the what should have been the cliffhanger was pretty good. However, I thought the direction of the scenes with Jack were pretty poor. The lighting that kept him going over Jack's face, I just didn't like. I think it ruined most of those shots, if I'm being honest. I just didn't like it. That was a bit of a downfall, because it's probably the worst directed bit of this series so far was the Jack scenes. So that was a bit of a bummer. However, most of the stuff with the Doctor was directed quite well. Finally, Second Akinola. Now, he's been a massive positive in this series as well. He really upped his game. However, this was probably his weakest scored episode of the series. Again, what should have been the cliffhanger was scored really well. It was scored like it was a cliffhanger, and it was really good. Really good music by Second Akinola. However, the rest of it, I wasn't a big fan of personally. I think Captain Jack's theme, or what seems like Captain Jack's theme, I'm just not a fan of. It's a bit cringy and overbearing. I wasn't really a fan of the music that played when Ruth got the Judoon to surrender at the end. Yeah, positive and negatives for Second Akinola, as with Nikki Manzur as the director. Yes, overall for this story, it just it's an odd one, isn't it? I get why so many fans like it. It's intriguing what's being set up here. However, that's what this episode is, setup. It annoys me that we had to have a good episode hijacked just to get this setup. And the thing is, I wouldn't have even minded if this episode was a two-parter and it ended 36 minutes in for that cliffhanger, and then we had a second part that was less about the Judoon and more about the dual doctors. I would have been fine with that. However, this episode isn't a two-parter, and it fits what should have been a second episode into the last 13 minutes of this story, and it really derails it into feeling like a complete story. It just more feels like ideas that are just being chucked at the screen and seeing what sticks, and unfortunately a lot of it doesn't really gel together. Captain Jack feels like he's from a completely different episode, as do his scenes, and are so out of place here. They reminded me of Missy's execution in extremis. Just didn't need to be there. Thing is, we've had episodes that move in to more plot setup in the past. Look at a story like The Time of Angels Flesh and Stone. That's a Weeping Angel story, but also towards the end includes a lot of setup and insight into the crack in time, which is obviously the series arc at the time. However, the difference is with that is that's a two-parter. The first part being about the angels, and the second part being about the angels, but also exploring ideas with the crack. That's how you should have done this episode. This episode should be a two-parter. I can't believe how it isn't. I've never seen an episode that shouldn't have been more of a two-parter as this one. It blows my mind because it's even set up like a cliffhanger 36 minutes in. It feels like it was supposed to be a two-parter, and then Chris Chibnall changed his mind and then wrote the last 30 minutes. An interesting one, because while I can't deny that the ideas and the setup are certainly intriguing, particularly with the dual doctors, I just feel like it's annoying we had to derail an interesting Judoon story to set up that. I feel that while the setup may pay off, this episode as a whole isn't going to be very rewatchable. And I think as a story, it doesn't feel like a story as much as just a bunch of setup being put together and nothing is really gelling well. It feels like a bunch of ideas there, and while all these ideas work together, I don't think they do. I also think the setup struggles from the setup not really fitting together. The Lone Sideman idea really doesn't fit together with Gallifrey destroying and the dual doctors, and the dual doctors idea doesn't really fit in with Gallifrey being destroyed or the Master. So it's kind of like you can have one of these three arcs, but I don't really think that you can have all three, or at least not try and set them up all three at the same time. This episode just struggled from being extremely rushed, an episode that should have been a two-parter and is even played as if it's a two-parter, but is only one, and it just having a good story derailed, and it just feeling like a blob of different ideas that are all set up that don't fit into this episode and don't gel together, and it leaves you with a resolution that's so quick and so unfulfilling and unsatisfying that it just left me just with such an empty feeling inside. As I've said, I understand why so many fans like this episode, because their setup is intriguing. However, I think if you actually look at the episode, I don't think it's a very good episode because it doesn't feel like a complete story. And as I said, if this episode was set up as just setup, was advertised as setup, like A Good Man Goes to War is, I probably would have been more fine with it. But just, I think what annoyed me is it starts off as its own story and then derails itself into setup that doesn't feel like it fits into the story, or at least not into a story that is only 50 minutes long. Therefore, it just doesn't feel like a good story to me. Upon rewatching it, I did like the scenes with Jodie. I thought she was very good in this episode, and I think that the first 36 minutes are solid as a first part, and are solid. It's just the last 30 minutes that really let it down. The setup is certainly intriguing, although it just didn't belong in this episode, and this episode really won't stand the test of time. It doesn't feel like a complete story as much as it just feels like setup for better stories in the long run. Yes, thank you guys for watching. If you enjoy this video, leave a like and drop a hit that notification bell to stay notified for all my latest videos. I'll be doing more Doctor Who Series 12 reviews, so stick around if you fancy. But yes, thank you guys for watching, and of course, a goodbye.